So we've walked through diversity, equity, inclusion. Our last conversation was great. We talked about understanding what racial and ethnic disparity looks like. In this segment, now I want to give you a possible way to address those issues. In Kentucky, I've been doing racial and ethnic disparity work for several years now. And with the Court of Justice, we developed a model that has been published and that has been adopted and used in some jurisdictions across the country. This model has 4 key components. And so, again, I just want to remind you of what our definition of racial and ethnic disparity is. There you see it on the screen. I'm not going to go over that, but in an attempt to address racial and ethnic disparities, we developed this model, okay? And I want to walk you through that over the next 2 sessions. Let me add some additional terms. Implicit bias, I want us to remember that term, think about that term. And that just deals with those attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding, affect our reactions to people groups. And it's important to look at bias and the possible impact of bias in individuals within our systems, but as a system as a whole. Are there systemic biases built into what we do? So implicit bias is an important term to remember. And then culture. When we talk about culture, we're talking about these integrated patterns of behavior that are associated with various social groups that we align ourselves with. We all have multiple groups that we interact with. We have a set of behaviors for our religious groups and our religious affiliations. We have a different set of behaviors for some of those professional groups that we align ourselves with. Culture deals with understanding those patterns of behavior. And then there's cultural competency, right? Building systems that work effectively in situations where there are multiple cultures present, which is your world, right? And so I want to start with this great endorsement from our Chief Justice of our Supreme Court, Chief Justice John D. Minton. He does these State of Judiciary addresses to our State Judiciary Interim Committee. And he talked specifically about this work, about the work we've been doing at the Court of Justice and its impact on policies and practices throughout the state of Kentucky. Very important endorsement, and I'll explain to you in a minute. So this is what the model looks like. And as you can see, that top bar is the goal, right? We don't want to get really in depth with processes. We're going to talk about processes, but the ultimate goal is to develop an organizational culture that leans into the conversation of racial and ethnic disparities. We're not offended when our data suggests differential treatment, differential processing, differential outcomes, right? We want to find out what it is that our systems may be doing to create these disproportionate representations at certain contact points and these disparate outcomes, right? This is the system. 4 key components, right? Identify, deals with statistical clarity. Construct, building the processes to address those disparities. Institutionalization, and then fidelity. We're going to talk about these 4 components, but today we're just going to deal with the first 2. Now, to do this, it requires leadership, right? Leadership on these, I think, critical levels, right? I always start when it comes to criminal justice work with judicial leadership, right? We know how critical judges are to moving the needle, to bringing stakeholders together, to convening meetings, right? To actually moving policy change. So you want to find those judicial partners at the state level, you want to find those judicial champions at the local level, and you want to try to find those judicial leaders that are willing to engage in this conversation. This process that we're undertaking cannot be solved in a silo. You have to engage your other system stakeholders. And then there's administrative leadership, right? Those policymakers at the highest level, people like yourself, right, need to be at the table having these conversations, talking about real systemic change. And then where necessary, right? Oftentimes we talk about communities, we fail to talk to them. This community advocacy piece is very important. I started this work nearly 25 years ago as a community advocate, and I continue to do this work as a community advocate, right? It's very important that you have that advocacy voice at the table. They can say things that sometimes those politicians, those elected officials, those system folks can't say. They can bring things to this conversation that oftentimes people that are involved in the system can't bring to the conversation. So leadership is important at all levels. So let's look at step one. Step one is very simple. In this step, you seek to know what you don't know. This is about identifying the problem, right? Understanding racial and ethnic disparity as it is revealed to you by your data, right? So it's important that we understand basic terminology, right? That we understand the definitions and we understand exactly what it looks like, right? Statistical clarity starts with identifying and those established contact points and those established decision points, right? That's where you start. Where does our system make decisions? At what point do we impact the outcome of those who come in contact with our system? You want to start by identifying those contact points, right? And then at those contact points, you want to define as steps, particular steps, which at each decision point happens, right? So at one contact point, there may be 3 different things that could happen. You want to capture each of those steps, each of those decisions, right? You want to think about those places where there's broad range of discretion, because as you walk through this process, you may need to, curtail some of that discretion. There are other places where policies may automatically trigger a response that really requires discretion. We just had a similar piece of legislation passed in Kentucky where we gave judges more discretion about making decisions about transfer to adult court as opposed to automatic transfers, which we think disproportionately affected African-American kids. So now giving judges and prosecutors the discretion to keep kids in juvenile court where they may be better served. It's one of those examples, right? And here's something I say about statistical clarity. Before the issues of racial and ethnic disparities can be effectively addressed, systems must clearly identify disproportionate and disparate outcomes for the clients they serve. You've got to be very familiar with those contact points and whether or not you're getting the equitable outcomes you desire. Conduct a data walk by race, right? And one of the things I do when I come into an organization to do this long-term equity work is I spend months just digging into data and asking questions of the data, which oftentimes mean getting more data. Sometimes we have to build the mechanisms to collect the data that we need, right? So it entails a very intentional mapping process of each contact point within your organization. Highlights area of success. You may start pulling your data and realize we're doing something really well over here, right? We have statistical parity over here. We have equity over here, right? When you start pulling that data and you realize that in a particular area we're doing great things, highlight those things, right? But then at the same time, you may find in other areas where there's significant overrepresentation. There's disparate outcomes, right? And that's what you want the data to tell you. We don't know why, so don't rush to judgment. Don't think that because you have disproportionality, it means that our organization is doing something wrong. No, it just means that we need to dig in and find out what's causing it, right? Sometimes it's a lack of community resources, right, that predispose individuals to certain outcomes. So now our work may become more about building capacity within communities, right? So don't rush to judgment, don't rush to a conclusion when you see that data. We're gonna walk through a process of being able to analyze that data to figure out if that data is a result of what we're doing. And then the construct phase. Now, once we walk through data and we get this clarity about our data, now we need to dig into our systems, right? Gather the tools that we need to build a new structure, right? To build a structure that's going to bring about those equitable outcomes. The data leads us to this place where we get to identify where our systems may be facilitating some of the inequities that we see, some of the disparities that we see. And then we get to the construction phase. Now we start to rebuild our system. We start to tear down processes that we've identified in that data analysis that are contributing to disparities. And then we start to build what we hope to be more inclusive processes and policies, right? This is where we start to introduce something I talked about a couple of sessions ago. Remember we talked about that racial equity assessment, right? In this construction phase, that's when we start to dig into things like racial equity assessments. That's when we start to get perspective from the people out there doing the work. That's when we start to realize how educated, our staff is on the issues of racial and ethnic disparities or not. When I first started doing this process, it was interesting how people didn't even recognize that they had a disproportionate amount of one group in a facility versus other groups. They just thought that was the way it was supposed to be. 90%, 80% African-American kids in our detention center when they only represent 25, 26% of that community's population. Nobody ever questioned that, right? And so when we did the racial equity assessment, we realized that people really didn't understand the terminology, right? So this racial equity assessment in this construction phase is important. This process is going to inform the perspective starting out. This process is going to show you how the culture of your organization is changing as you do this from year to year. We do this every year in one of the Kentucky Court of Justice programs. And where we are now in perspective and employee understanding about these issues is light years away from where we were in that first equity assessment. And then in this construction phase, we also begin to establish our own unique strategic plan that provides for us a pathway forward, right? This plan is not cast in concrete, right? As we do those racial assessments, as we continue to look at data, this process of looking at data and reevaluating our performance measures, then we start to build that strategic plan. In that strategic plan, it kind of guides our steps moving forward. We also break that strategic plan down to the local level. So one level, we can do that on a district-wide level. We can do that on a statewide level. If you're dealing with a district that covers multiple states, you can have a plan for your entire district. And then you can break that plan down based on smaller groupings, right? But you develop that local action plan that kind of directs the framework and the timelines for accountability, for having conversations, for pulling data sets, for going through data walks, and assessing the changes that are being made along the way. Each local action plan develops their own strategies, right? Based on their local unique challenges, right? It's important that when you break this work down to the local level, because each local, in Kentucky Court of Justice, we have 10 counties. Each of those counties are dealing with racial and ethnic disparity at different contact points. One county may be focusing on arrests, right? Another county may be focusing on access to diversion. Another county may be focusing on the disparate rate in which African-American kids don't complete diversion, right? Each county will come up with these unique plans to deal with the racial and ethnic disparities in their local county. I can't underestimate this enough, but at the same time, I give this caveat, right? Training is very important. I get to go all over the country and do training with folks, implicit bias, cultural competency, a race conversation entitled Let's Talk Race. I'm starting to do some anti-racism training as well. But training without this equity work is not going to be effective. So you do want to have that training piece. This particular slide is a great piece from Johns Hopkins University professor Rebecca Fix. She did a year-long empirical evaluation of the training that I do with justice professionals, and this is one of the outcomes. Engage stakeholders, not just within your systems, not just other systemic stakeholders, but also engage community stakeholders. One of the things we found in Kentucky when dealing with this work was that we lacked the community supports we needed to produce effective outcomes for certain populations. And instead of talking about them, we went into those communities and we talked to them. We provided resources, they provided volunteer base, and we lifted up the diversion programs we needed in those communities, and they've done phenomenal work. Also during this construction phase, we analyze policies and procedures. We analyze our policies and practice. Once that data walk is completed and we look at where those disproportionate representations occur and where those disparate outcomes occur, the next thing is to really start analyzing our policies. In this process, we also do a root cause analysis, and we try to find out what are the root causes to some of the disparities. And that root cause analysis will drive you to policy and practice. Are there policies and practices and procedures in place that facilitate some of the disparate outcomes? For instance, again, in Louisville, Kentucky, we found where police had policies and practice in place in one side of town, but not another side of town. And we believe very strongly that these policies you have in one side of town contributes to the disparities we see at certain types of arrests. Not that these folks over here are not committing the same types of offenses, but they're just less likely to be stopped and searched. So we dig into those policies and procedures. So that's the construction phase. Now, next time we'll get together, we'll start talking about institutionalizing some of the changes that we discovered that are working, and then just a little bit on fidelity work and how to continue to go back. I'll share some successes with you from our work there in Kentucky. And so I look forward to finishing our time together in the next conversation. See you soon. Bye.